Hi everyone,
Hello.
welcome.
Hello.
Thanks for joining. So we'll wait a couple more minutes for everybody to join. Nice, so we have Berlin, we have Uganda, we have Maastricht, wow, Brisbane, Australia, Ireland, Singapore, lots of different places.
It's also interesting for me. It's kind of my two UWC worlds merging together. Like I have some people from way back when in India and some people from UWC Robert Bosch College today. So it's those two UWC bubbles merging in one room now, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, these talks are always also a bit kind of family gatherings in a
Yeah.
way, because there's so many connections going on. Cool. Then I'd say let's start. So first of all, today I'm going to be your host together with Sarah, who is also here on the screen. And this is UWC talk number 17, believe it or not. It's been a long way. But so I would like just to say a couple of words about Tobi. So Tobi is, as you were saying, Tobi, you are UWC Mahindra alum. And now Tobi is also the sustainability coordinator at UWC Robert Bosch College. And actually I met Tobi 1 year ago exactly at Robert Bosch when I was visiting the school, and he talked to me about the UWC Forests project. He said, I'm kind of talking to people because I would like this to happen. And you know, now the first kind of fruits of that work have come to reality. So I'm very happy that he's here with us to talk to us about the project and how it has moved forward. So thanks a lot, Tobi. It's great to have you here. The floor is yours. You can take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. So hello, everyone. So yes, I'm Tobi, currently sustainability coordinator at UWC Robert Bosch College. But as we just said, way back 20 years ago, I was actually a student myself at UWC Mahindra College. I'm very glad to see people from Mukhi here. I'm also very impressed by people telling me that it's 1 a.m. where they are. I see Zan there and Lawrence, and so many familiar faces. It's amazing. So I actually have my usual weakness is that I have way too many slides, and it's no different today. And so I'll probably be a lot in slide mode, but I'll try and come back to just present a view every now and then, just so that you also see my pretty face, because I think just looking at slides just may get too much. But let me see how I get this started. So if you don't see the PowerPoint now, then I don't know, give me some sign, but I think it should be okay. So very briefly, what I'll try to get through today is I'll do a quick intro, even though that kind of already has happened. I'll talk a little bit about what I see as challenges in UWC sustainability education, because that actually kind of explains why I'm trying to push this UWC Forests idea so much. I then talk about what the UWC Forests idea is actually all about, tell you about what has happened so far, especially in the last year or even last 2-3 months really. And then we can finish talking about the next steps and hopefully then have a discussion about what those next steps could be together. So very briefly, yes, I'm currently the sustainability coordinator at Robert Bosch College. Before that, I actually worked a long time in Wales at the Centre for Alternative Technology. It's an eco-centre where I worked for 5 years. And way before that, I was actually myself at Mukhi. So this is just for nostalgia's sake and to prove my credentials. This is me in Mukhi. And this is what the campus looked back then. So this is where my first round of UWC had been. And this is now my current UWC home, UWC Robert Bosch College. Both very beautiful places, both very formative places for me. And I want to talk a little bit now about the challenges in UWC sustainability education as I see them, from my role of sustainability coordinator, and kind of what I've been battling and banging my head against over the last, it's been now 4 or 5 years, at UWC Robert Bosch College. So of course, we probably don't need a reminder, that sustainability is now centrally built into our mission statement, that it is about making education a force that unites people for peace and a sustainable future. And it's an interesting point that the ones with gray hair or the older ones of us know that sustainability actually hasn't always been part of the UWC mission. So I certainly remember a UWC mission that didn't have sustainability in it. Now, I don't actually remember the wording of the UWC mission in my time, but I remember there was no word sustainability in it. So already there we have the issue of, is it really core of the mission at the moment, or is it something that has been added on to it? And where I see the challenges is the one big elephant in the room actually is that currently UWC has very little credibility on the climate crisis. So I would argue that, that we currently have a massive problem here. We are massively part of the problem. And just to put this a bit in context, at UWC RBC, we are now very active in doing footprinting, where we really try and measure all our carbon emissions. Whenever students travel, we hand out online questionnaires for them to document where they've traveled. We document how much energy we've used and all that. And basically, by the day the students have arrived on campus, just from flying from all around the world to UWC Robert Bosch College, we essentially already blow our carbon budget. So, at that point, just students traveling to the school already accounts for some 200 tons of CO2 emissions, which order of magnitude is already kind of as much as in some form of climate sustainable future we should have per person for a whole year, if we still can emit any CO2 at all. So I think this is a massive issue for UWC, that we claim that we have sustainability as part of our mission, but at the moment we need to acknowledge that we are actually arguably massively part of the problem, that our business model, quote unquote, is built around a concept that is very hard to square with the realities of climate chaos and climate change. And I think there's a big question for us of how can we actually become part of the solution there. So the other point that really only struck me once I really, took on the role of sustainability coordinator at UWC is that I realized that international understanding and intercultural understanding is absolutely built into the core of the UWC education model. I sometimes say, no matter how hard we try, we couldn't mess that one up. No matter what we do or don't do in the classrooms, the very fact that we bring together people from so many backgrounds, from so many countries, automatically means that we are absolutely unique in the education landscape. I think we'd all agree in terms of, giving people such an intense educational experience when it comes to international and intercultural understanding. But I don't think we can make the same claim about sustainability. Sustainability isn't built into the UWC education model in the same way as intercultural and international understanding is. And actually, it's difficult to build it in. I think and I'm not just saying that because Lawrence is looking at me from the corner of the screen, but I really think that, I'm at a school where everyone is incredibly supportive of giving more space to sustainability, but it's so difficult because the UWC day itself is already so full. As we all know that, trying to add anything to it actually is difficult. There's already so much going on in UWC life. And as I said, the intercultural aspect is built into every single aspect of it. Whereas we're trying to add sustainability onto it. And arguably we're doing a much better job than, your average school. But we're not nearly as, I'd say, as special and as, much of a role model on sustainability education as we are on international and intercultural understanding, I would argue. And then the third challenge is that I've personally really struggled with finding globally relevant messages. So I'm not sure what people here have experienced, but my experience is that it's very easy for sustainability messages to become things like, eat less meat, fly less, use recycled paper, consume less. And those are messages that have two things in common. The first is, all these don't messages and do the less of this and less of that messages, they're important. They're absolutely crucial, but they're not actually super inspiring in terms of, building your life around those. I mean, I'm not sure whose life passion really is reducing waste. It's harder to get passionate about that. And the other issue that we're experiencing at UWC RBC is that a lot of students from, I don't know what the currently correct terminology is, from poorer countries, from economically developing countries, very often say that many of the messages sustainability messages that we talk about in school just aren't relevant where they go, where they come from and the communities they go back to. They say to me, look, Toby, if I go back home to my community and tell them fly less and eat less meat and buy less consumer electronics so that the polar bears don't drown, this doesn't fly with the people at all because A, nobody can afford flying in a plane there. be, meat, the chickens they rear in their own land, is their main source of good proteins. And in terms of consumerism, if anything, the problem these people have is that they can't afford anything. So I found that a lot of the messaging around sustainability, that's sort of very much from a Western reducing consumerism perspective, isn't very relevant in an international environment. And I also find a lot of the messaging that is about doing less of something not super inspiring for giving young people, a cause to, sort of to build their life around, to get really excited about. And this is actually something where maybe at this point, because I've been talking quite a bit, I'd actually be interested in hearing a few voices, from people with UWC experience about, what is it like at other UWCs? Do you also have this tension that people from some backgrounds and some communities say, actually, a lot of the sustainability messaging doesn't really work for us? I'd really be curious. So I don't sure how we do that, but maybe we can hear some voices if anyone has something to say about that.
Sure. If you want to mute yourself or if you want to write in the chat, that's either of that is possible.
You can also raise your hand and I can, okay, Reed?
Yeah, this is Reed. I'm the history and TOK teacher at MUCI. To build on what Toby said, we do get a lot of pushback from students from, I would say, the developing world who say, well, basically what you're telling us is that our countries can't develop. How are we going to get there to where your standard is if we can't do, burn fossil fuels or do whatever it may be? But their big pushback is basically, this is just another example of the rich world telling the poor world how to live their lives. And so there's this really big pushback from people from that part of the world. It's not just the simple things like don't buy this or don't eat meat. It's simply like they feel like we're telling them they can't develop economically by imposing these sustainability standards on them.
That's definitely also part of the discussion and the issue we're having at our school. Yes.
Brian here from Maastricht. So I teach ESS and TOK. And bounced around a couple of UWC Costa Rica and Diligent as well. And yeah, Toby, your critique resonates quite strongly. And certainly I see that in my classes and conversations with students. Although one place where I feel like sometimes the conversation dynamic shifts, and I think where maybe UWC has some potential, is to invite different visions for what sustainability might look like that aren't so centered around Western, Euro-American style consumerism. And so I think sometimes it can seem like scolding, but I think there's also a way in which you can flip it around and say, this is we see that this model is broken on so many levels. Can we look to other cultures, other approaches to life that can offer better models going forward?
Okay, I see a few interesting comments here also in the chat.
Just reading them as well. Yeah. MJ and Arvin from Pearson, which is my alumna. At Pearson, the tension we talk about is sustainability as green capital versus as indigenous climate justice, green capitalism. Yeah, that's an interesting comment. I agree too. Sorry, I'm trying to read and process at the same time. Does anyone else want to speak out loud? Just in the interest of time, we'll have a couple. We'll take maybe one or two more if there's anyone else, because we'll have more questions at the end. I don't want to stifle conversation, but Nila, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I went to Waterford, and I don't know, maybe it was just like the bubble of people I was with, but like I didn't have the feeling we had so much this fly less, because the transport within the countries was usually by buses anyways. But I did have the feeling at some point we started like looking at what were the problems where we were. So for example, there were like no trash cans in the community where the campus is in, like in the village around it. And like it was a project that in the end didn't work out, but I think it was a lot like pushing towards teaching people like how to recycle and like asking people how to set up like trash cans and things like that. So it wasn't that much on the big scale, let's change the world, but much like smaller. And I think that that's something UWC in general can work on a lot, like acting locally.
Thank you, Nila. We'll take one more. Kaylin, sorry if I mispronounced that.
I'm Kalin from Adriatic, and I graduated in 2001 when we didn't really talk about sustainability. It was something that came up a bit later, I think. But one thing that struck me already at the time was that some of my teachers were trying to achieve zero waste in their own household. It was a personal project. The first time I saw something like that anywhere, and I was mightily impressed, to say the least. Also, one of the talks, one of our guest speakers who came to Adriatic was the person who inspired me to become an activist. I've been a volunteer in environmental NGOs and social NGOs since 2001. And when I came back to Bulgaria, which is on the border between developed and developing countries, the border between Western and Eastern, the West and the East, I realized that people have arrived at the same ideas totally independently from what we were taught at the United World Colleges. So I don't know how it is these days. I'll be interested to hear our younger members here, but maybe the colleges can really learn from NGOs in the area where they are. Like it's a two-way movement these days. Thank you.
Thank you. I also read there's a few interesting comments, for example, about decolonization and about the role of developing versus developed, or richer versus poorer nations. And I think those are exactly also the kind of discussions we need to have in UWC when we talk about sustainability. So my personal experience has been that, you know, the messaging that we have, you know, but which is a lot about reducing waste and reducing energy consumption, is absolutely necessary, but in itself not very inspiring sometimes, and it doesn't reach a lot of students. And especially every year when I kind of have a feedback session on, you know, for the students who are leaving about, you know, how was the sustainability education in the school for you over the last 2 years, a lot of them say, look, you know, pretty much most of the stuff that we've talked about, I just can't see how this is relevant in actually my home community. And this is kind of a recurring pattern. And I'm always, you know, banging my head against, you know, how can we actually get different messages that are more relevant to students for whom, you know, fly less, eat less meat, and all these things maybe don't feel so relevant. So this is kind of, you know, the three overlapping issues that I really struggle with in terms of making UWC or making UWC Robert Bosch College about sustainability. You know, how can we have credibility on the climate crisis? How can we have something on sustainability that feels as central and as unique as we have on international understanding and intercultural understanding? And what kind of messages can we have that really inspire young people from all around the world, and not just sort of, you know, messages directed at reducing consumerism? And this is where I want to take a deviation to, you know, where I've personally found an answer, or at least, you know, one of the answers, and that's in this topic of ecosystem restoration that I think John Liu, the filmmaker, has called it the great work of our time. What's ecosystem restoration? Well, if we say that sort of, you know, sustainability is technically defined as stopping to F up the world, I mean, essentially sustainability is about getting to a stage where we're not making things worse and where we can keep on doing things forever without, you know, gradually damaging things even more. Then ecosystem restoration is actually about un-effing the world and making it beautiful again. So really ecosystem restoration in sort of like an informal definition is about undoing damage and restoring beauty, restoring healthy, beautiful ecosystems. Of course, there is a more technical definition that is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed, but I like un-effing the world more personally. And for me, ecosystem restoration is a topic that I've increasingly become fascinated with over the last years, partially because I consider it so important, and partially because I find it a lot more positive and inspiring than a lot of the other sustainability messages, even though I immediately want to say it's not either or. We need both of these aspects, obviously. We need to stop doing more damage, but we also need to start looking at the repairing. And sort of basically at the core of it is the question of, you know, can we restore land that looks like this? I mean, any of you who've traveled around the world know that we have a lot of land in the world that is, you know, barren, dry. It looks totally, you know, bare of any vegetation. And very often then when you look into it, you realize that this has once been green, often forested, and then through various processes, you know, starting with deforestation, then overgrazing, very often more wrong grazing, leading to soil erosion. And then you get into kind of vicious circles and land looks like this. And the question is, once land looks like this, is there anything we can do about it? And the answer is yes. So I really love this photo because it actually, you know, shows in the here and now, you know, just the difference that can be made in a few years. This is from a project in India. I actually am not totally sure where. I think it's in Andhra Pradesh, where through a range of measures, they brought back vegetation, they restored the land. And it's sometimes just amazing what differences you can make in short periods of time. And for me, those pictures, you know, of repairing are also psychologically so inspiring, because it goes beyond the whole, okay, we need to reduce our footprint and need to do less and less of something, to actually saying, look, we can do something good. And I think that's just a really inspiring message also for young people. And we ourselves have good evidence of that, you know, even within the UWC movement. So this picture shows the pioneer generation of MUCI. So my second years arriving on campus, and anyone who knows Mahindra College campus knows that it looks very different now. But back then it was a totally barren place. You know, there wasn't kind of like, apart from the plants in the pots, there wasn't a plant in sight. And even the wider area around the college, you know, was grassland at best. And, you know, this is what MUCI looked like roughly at the time when I was there. And those who are there now will know that, you know, even for a few years now, it has looked like this. You know, it really has become much greener, much more forested. There is a biodiversity area now. So arguably the UWC movement already has in-house experience in ecosystem restoration. I don't want to go into the technicalities of how it works, because, you know, this shouldn't be a masterclass in ecosystem restoration, and I wouldn't actually be the person to do it. But basically, it's relatively simple measures of erosion control, soil restoration and replanting that allow us to take landscapes that have been degraded through humans and put them back to a much more lively, beautiful, biodiverse and biomass-rich state. So ecosystem restoration, what is it? It's very much not just tree planting. That's an important part that very often we talk about tree planting, and I will talk about tree planting a lot, but actually, you know, depending on where you are in the world, trees are very often part of it, but so are soils and streams and lakes and grasslands and wetlands, etc. So it's about restoring all sorts of ecosystems. And even where you're talking about reforestation, it's about a lot more than sticking trees into the ground. Patrick Worms, who works for the World Agroforestry Organization, once said, yeah, it's kind of like, you know, planting a tree is like having sex. You know, it takes half an hour, and, you know, afterwards you're sweaty and you feel good. Restoring a forest is like raising a child, you know, several decades of hard work and a lot of setbacks and frustrations. But in the end, hopefully you have something to be proud of. I like that analogy. So even though I will talk about tree planting, it's actually important to know we're talking about something much bigger than just sticking trees into the ground. It's also not necessarily about an idea about restoring any kind of untouched nature. I mean, just looking at the list of people who are in this chat, I know that we could have long philosophical discussions about the concept of nature and the concept of untouched nature. And, you know, does it even make sense to talk about, you know, the original state? But regardless of that, from a very practical perspective, in a lot of parts of the world, it makes a lot more sense to talk about restoring landscapes to healthy agroecological systems, you know, where the soils and the hydrological cycles and biodiversity are restored, but at the same time, where humans actually benefit from the landscape, you know, through harvesting fruits and trees, through having livestock there. So while, you know, restoring sort of untouched, quote unquote, jungle might be part of the picture, in a lot more cases, actually, it is about restoring landscapes so that they're useful for both the environment and for humans. And it's very much not about this idea of greening the desert. So as the ESS teachers in this chat obviously will affirm, you know, deserts are natural ecosystems that are valuable in their own rights. And there's a huge difference between natural desert ecosystems and landscapes that have been degraded through human activity. So sort of kind of my rule of thumb is, you know, anything that was green and forested 50 or 100 years ago, it probably makes sense looking at, can that become, you know, a green forested landscape? Or anything that was a swamp 50 or 100 years ago, you know, can we turn that into a wetland again? But this whole notion of, you know, establishing forests in the middle of the Sahara where there haven't been forests for at least thousands of years, I mean, it's an interesting thing in its own right, but I don't think it's necessarily a particularly useful or project or one with a very high chance of succeeding. So we're not talking about greening deserts, but about repairing places that once were green and trying to make them greener again. And so why does it matter? You know, why am I so banging on about ecosystem restoration? Well, the one thing is, on climate change, pretty much any scenario that I've ever seen about, you know, how we can avoid the worst of the climate crisis does involve reducing our carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions as quickly and as radically as possible. Absolutely. Like there's no way around, you know, cutting our emissions as much and as hard as possible. But even then, almost all the scenarios that I'm aware of, in addition, have what's called net negative processes. So that simply means, you know, something that sucks the carbon and the greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere out of the atmosphere again. Because even if we totally stop emitting today, we still have enough greenhouse gas in the atmosphere to create a huge amount of problems, you know, for decades and centuries to come. So we need to have some way to suck it out of the air. And the simple reality is that, you know, despite all the news articles you may see about, you know, some crazy factory sponsored by Bill Gates that, you know, has lots of pipes and chemistry and arguably sucks CO2 out of the atmosphere, currently restoring soils and restoring biomes is way more effective at sucking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere at large scale than anything technological we can think of. I'm not an enemy of technology, you know, I'm quite a geek myself, but trees simply work much better than chemical factories on that task. And I mean, here I have a headline from National Geographic who claimed that we could erase 100 years of carbon emissions by planting trees. I'm not sure about that, you know, whether we could really, you know, suck 100 years worth of CO2 emissions out of the atmosphere, but pretty much everyone agrees that it's arguably the biggest tool in the toolkit that we have when it comes to actually taking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, which is something we need to do in addition to reducing emissions of new greenhouse gases. So those are not either ors, those are things that need both to be done at the same time. The other thing is biodiversity. I mean, sometimes we get so focused on climate change that we actually forget that habitat loss is for a lot of species the biggest driver of species loss. So, you know, currently actually in a lot of cases, we're not losing species primarily due to climate changes, but simply because the habitats get destroyed. And of course, restoring ecosystems also restores habitat. So, you know, that's from a biodiversity perspective, a driver. By the way, I'm sorry for the noise. I'm not sure if you hear it. Somebody decided to do some work just outside my window and I don't really know where else to go. And the last point is human well-being. You know, at the risk of stating the blatantly obvious, dead landscapes are bad for people. You know, it's as simple as that. Even though it may originally have been, you know, people trying to get value out of nature by deforesting or by, you know, sending a lot of livestock into the landscape that caused the degradation of landscapes. Once the land is barren and dry and has no topsoil, it usually also doesn't sustain people and it doesn't sustain prosperity. So actually, at the moment, we're in a situation where the livelihoods of billions of people are affected by ecosystem degradation or are threatened by it. And as with so many things, it's often the most vulnerable people that are most affected. So if we look at this map here, this shows the human-induced soil degradation in the world. And if we look at where we have the biggest problems of soil degradation, we see that a lot of that is in parts of the world where we already have very high population densities. And some of it, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa is also in the parts of the world where, you know, over the next 50 years, we have more population growth projected. I'm not somebody banging on about population growth as a big problem. I think that's very often is overdone, but there is a reality that, you know, we will see population growth in parts of the world where already a lot of the landscape is highly degraded. And obviously, you know, feeding more people on less land is in itself a massive problem. So this is another reason, purely from a human welfare perspective, bringing landscape back to a point where there are life, where there's sustained life, where there's sustained productivity is good for people. So these are kind of, for me, the main drivers for why I think ecosystem restoration is something that, while it won't in itself, you know, save us if we don't do all the other things like reducing consumerism, like reducing carbon emissions, I don't see a way for us to kind of, you know, make it through this century without also massively going into ecosystem restoration. And while it's kind of become fashionable to not care about what the UN says, I think the fact that the United Nations have declared 2021 to 2030 as the decade of ecosystem restoration does show that the importance of this topic is more and more becoming recognized. I'm kind of going back from the slide for a moment just to see, because I haven't seen the chat in a long time, if there is any comments or questions at this point. Anyone wants to raise anything? Okay, so let's just go on. Or is there anything anyone wants to say?
Also write to me and I will take names and we can do the list at the end as well. If people are, I don't know if people are saving for the end or, yeah, you can read out some of the comments as well. The people who've written the comments can read them out or discuss them at the end as well, if people are interested in that. So just let me know, send me a message.
Yeah. I'm already reading some comments about what's already happening in Singapore. And yes, I've heard about that. And it sounds like it's a really great project and it fits very well with all the things that I think UWC should be doing. So that's great to read about. Okay, so I'll go back to the slides. So this is kind of the backdrop. So, over the last years, I've more and more become a bit frustrated with, sustainability messaging that was just about stop doing this, stop doing that. I've become frustrated with this kind of like catch-22 of UWC and climate change that, on the one hand, we want to be part of the solution, but on the other hand, actually, we have built in a massive source of greenhouse gas emissions. And these problems, and at the same time, my awareness of ecosystem restoration as a really both necessary in the sense that we can't make it without it, but also just very inspiring in terms of like, who wouldn't want to be involved in creating something beautiful out of something destroyed? The combination of, seeing the problems and seeing that great idea has led me to think about, okay, how could we bring ecosystem restoration into the UWC movement? So I've called this, why UWC should swipe right on ecosystem restoration. And I want you to sort of, I want you to actually now go a bit into what's it in TOK, like imagination as a way of knowing. Just imagine what this UWC Forest idea could be like. So imagine it's the 20th of June, 2030. It's 8:30 in the morning. You are at UWC Forest Tukal in Morocco, and you feel two emotions. On the one hand, you are super tired, which probably looking at some of you, you can fairly easily, get your head into what it feels like to be super tired. And in this case, imagine you are super tired because you have actually just spent 3 days on a train from Freiburg, from UWC Robert Bosch College, where you just finished your first year, on a train to come to Morocco. And you look at the faces around you and they also look super tired, but you're also super excited because you look around, you see some faces, there's around 20 people from your school, your co-years, but also there's people from other UWCs. Some of them you've met in Zoom calls before. Some of the people from Maastricht UWC, you actually, went on the train together with for some part of the journey. The Atlantic College people had a horrible trip because, the UK rejoining the EU actually made border crossings even more complicated. There's a lot of Moroccan young people around that you haven't seen before at all. And that's just exciting, these people. But then also being in this place is exciting because while you've never been here, you have actually heard so much about this place. This is the place where it seems in every second Monday assembly in the morning, there was some kind of video update about what our forest is doing, how the trees are growing. You heard about it in class. You did coursework in ESS or in geography about it. And now finally you're here and you actually really see the place. You've done a lot of preparation work for this. You designed the whole experiment on measuring insect biodiversity. And now in those 2 weeks, you're excited to really be in that place and see it happen. So this is kind of the vibe, that I'm imagining. UWC Forests are places where UWC students come together to work on ecosystem restoration and to learn. So I have another illustration that the people who've probably heard me talk about this a lot probably can't see it anymore because I show it so much, but this is kind of a picture that I had somebody draw of the kind of place that I would like to see emerge. A place that's both about actual restoration. So on the left-hand side, we see trees being planted, just because planting trees is a lot easier to visualize than restoring wetlands, for example. But on the right-hand side, we also see the young people coming together and learning about these ecosystem restoration techniques aspect happening. So it's a place of meeting, a place of education, and a place of actual restoration. So UWC Forests, as kind of I dreamt up this idea, are in the first instance places where UWC simply financially support ecosystem restoration projects to reduce their climate impact. So this is kind of good old-fashioned offsetting. And I actually have a big problem with offsetting. I'm very critical because I think it very often leads to a risk of people not doing as much as they can to reduce their impact because they say, well, we're paying for somebody to plant trees, so it's all right. So I want to make sure that really, while this is a form of, compensating for greenhouse gas emissions, it should only be done after or in addition to making all the reductions locally that you can possibly make. But it is also, it does have an offset character where UWCs say, okay, even after doing everything we could do, we still have 1,000 tons of CO2 emissions per year. Now let us support an ecosystem restoration project somewhere in the world that locks up carbon in biomass in soils to roughly that scale. And that's something I think, that more or less most institutions, I think, will have 5 years down the line, they will be involved in some kind of offsetting scheme or another. But I think UWC has the potential to do so much more than that, because I think these UWC forests, as I imagine them, are places where really also young people come together, people from different UWCs, people from other schools, people from local areas, and practice and learn ecosystem restoration hands-on on the spot. I think the one thing that we really as UWC movement should avoid is a solution where 5 years down the line, every college simply sends off a paycheck to some kind of offsetting organization every year, for them to, offset carbon, plant trees. And then at the end of the year, we get a nice greeting card saying, thank you for your money, and we've planted trees for you. You are now carbon neutral. Because if we think about our mission statement, those kind of skills that are involved, whether that's in renewable energy or in ecosystem restoration, are exactly the things actually we should teach about. That should be a core part of the UWC experience. So to simply outsource it by paying somebody else to do it without being involved in it, I think we'd be missing such a trick. So it really is about, yes, it is about paying for the work, but it's also about involving the students in it. And part of that could also be that the students, for example, carry out the monitoring of the climate benefits and the biodiversity benefits. So I'm deliberately not picturing this as an idea where the students go and do the majority of the tree planting work, because to be honest, that notion is like A, very unrealistic, and B, it kind of very often has this paternalistic perspective that, people somewhere else in the world need our students to come and plant trees because our students are so great at holding shovels. I think, the restoration work, realistically, a lot of the tree planting, let's say, will be done by people who are much better at doing that. But I think one place where the students actually really could make a difference and also could have a massive learning impact is in the monitoring of the projects. If you look into carbon offset projects and if you look at the economics of them, which I've done for a bit, you realize that a large chunk of the money actually doesn't go into the planting the trees or installing the solar panels or whatever, but into the verification work, into somebody going there and checking, are those trees really there? Are they growing? How much have they grown? And this is something I think that could totally be part of an education program that, students they go out with a tape measure, they literally measure 10,000 trees, they have the GPS coordinates, and every year they measure how tall are they, what's the circumference, they calculate the carbon, they compare that to last year, they see how much the forest has actually grown, and then they put that in perspective of, for example, their school's carbon emissions. And students carry out biodiversity surveys, for example. So I think this is the kind of work where really students could make a contribution to these kind of projects. And, sorry, I'm going too fast. And I think beyond current students going there for maybe, what would be a short course realistically, maybe between, the first and the second year in the summer holidays, or maybe in the Christmas holidays. In addition to that, I also imagine those to be places where UWC graduates, for example, recent graduates during a gap year, stay with the project for a whole year, work with the project, and kind of function as a link between the project and the schools. Because the whole idea about this is that this isn't a project that, it's out of sight, out of mind, and, we pay the money for the planting the trees, and maybe we send some students once a year, but it's a project that is present in daily school life as much as possible, really becomes part of the school. And I think having people there who, for example, send a video update for every second Monday assembly, or who work with the teachers in the school to, prepare lessons on, let's say, soil degradation for geography that are actually based on the real UWC forest. I think that would be the strength of the project, having people there all the time to make the links to the schools. So the forests are linked to the UWCs in this idea through the students visiting them. So, short courses, 2-week, 3-week-long courses, a bit like the UWC short courses we have already, but specifically on ecosystem restoration at the physical locations of the forests. But they're also linked through regular updates about what's happening there, for example, in assembly, and integration into classroom teaching as much as possible. So what we see here is, this was a geography class that I taught, and it was geography on soil degradation, on land degradation. And the students were talking about all these things, you know, about the role of soil and plants and the feedback between vegetation and rain and all these things. And I was thinking, you know, how cool would it be if we actually had a project somewhere in the world where, you know, some of those students might be going in summer, and where some of their second years have already been, and where some graduates are currently there, and actually, you know, tying that project into the classroom and saying, well, let's look at this, you know, in the context of our UWC forest. Let's talk to the people who are there and talk to them about how they are managing, you know, erosion control, for example. So I think there's massive potential for linking the forest and the school, so to say. And of course, UWCs in different parts of the world have projects in different locations. This is where the plural comes in. Like, I think the idea that all UWCs should have one forest would then necessarily lead to people from all around the world fly to their, like, to that one forest. And like, I think the idea of flying to the carbon offset project would be very self-defeating. So very much different parts of the world, different UWCs, different projects. Some of them might be about reforestation, others might be about different types of ecosystem restoration. But even then, even if they have different projects in different parts of the world, there's probably massive potential for sharing resources, ideas, educational concepts, experiences. So hopefully this would also be something that ties the UWCs together. I mean, sometimes I think, you know, each UWC is its own little bubble, so busy with, you know, just its own UWC reality that it's hard to even, you know, look beyond, you know, your own school. And I think if all UWCs were tied into projects of that type and kind of had a common project, there would also be a lot of connections between the UWCs. So what I like about the idea is that I think it would be a credible response to the climate crisis. Yes, you would still have to talk about flying and how we can reduce it, but at least saying, you know, we are having massive landscape scale reforestation projects would give us some credibility on this topic. It would be something where we could say, now we really have something in our educational concept that makes us special and that gives us credibility on saying sustainability is at the core of the UWC education. And I think for a lot of students for whom, you know, messages about shopping less and eating less meat aren't so relevant, or where they come from parts of the world where they don't feel relevant, actually talking about how we can restore landscapes that are degraded and improve livelihoods should be very relevant. So I'm not saying we should stop talking about flying and consumerism and all these things, but I think that really this could kind of supplement it. So this is the broad idea of the UWC forest, like really educational places where students do their carbon offsetting, but also where schools do their carbon offsetting, but also where students go and kind of experientially learn ecosystem restoration. So this is the basic concept. I'm not sure if any urgent questions have come up at this point.
We have some questions, but I think they're for the end. So just let us know.
Okay, let's do them at the end. Cool. Then I'll continue.
Building the list. Thanks.
Good. Okay. So this is on a nice stream. So I know probably like some of you like feel like a bit short-sold now because this was all stuff in the future and grand visions, and every one of us can have grand visions once we drink too much coffee. You know, having dreams is easy, making them reality is the hard part. So the question is, does any of this exist already? And this is where I'm fortunate to say that actually quite a bit has happened over the last year. So this is the point now where, even though you've already sat through 45 minutes of me talking, I will now tell you about my summer holiday last summer. Because last summer I went to Morocco by bus and train to visit the High Atlas Foundation. They are an NGO based in Marrakesh, and they have more than 20 years of experience in community development, not exclusively, but also majorly through tree planting. So they are, you can see, you know, Moroccan, young, dynamic, relatively small team, even though they're growing quite a bit at the moment. You see their logo on the right-hand side, and you actually realize there's 3 languages on it: Arabic on the top, English at the bottom, but in the middle is the local Berber language, where embarrassingly I always forget the name, because they actually, their activities in the High Atlas Mountains, where ethnically people are originally from various Berber ethnicities. And they have really a long track record in working with communities, for example, through tree planting. And what's special about their approach, and what makes me really think that they are, you know, doing things right, is that they don't start with going to somebody and say, look, you know, we're gonna dig wells for you or plant trees for you or whatnot. They start by going to communities and asking them, is there anything you want? You know, what would be something that improves your community? They have community consultation processes. And in fact, they've realized that very often, before they can even do that, they need to do empowerment workshops, because they realize that, you know, in a lot of conservative rural areas, if the men and the women are together without any preparation, sometimes the women are quite quiet and only the men speak, and then the village gets what the men wanted. So very often what they do is they first do youth and women's empowerment workshops where they learn to speak up and find their voice. Then they do a community consultation process where the community, now hearing all the voices, talks about what would help that community. And then sometimes the answer involves tree planting. And this is where they run a network of small nurseries in really remote places. So this picture I took myself, and it's like, you drive 3-4 hours on very small dusty roads high up in the Atlas Mountains. And then there's just like one polytunnel where one local person is employed to plant 20,000-30,000 tree saplings. They're all fruit and nut trees. So those are all trees that actually will bring an economic benefit to people. There is carob, there is walnut, there is fig, there is cherry, you name it, they probably plant it if it's suitable for that climate. And the trees are then all planted and owned by the local communities, which I'm not banging on about because, of the warm, fluffy feeling that it gives you, but for very pragmatic reasons. And that's simply, I think any type of restoration project stands and falls with local communities actually wanting this to happen. Because if you plant trees somewhere in another part of the world where people don't actually care much about those trees, they will not survive. Whereas if people have a stake and have a real interest in, these trees growing and prospering because they're their trees and they will have the benefit from them, then you know that the project has a chance to succeed. So this is the High Atlas Foundation. I will just play the first 20 seconds of a video by Ecosia. So the Ecosia, the search engine, they are actually a partner of the High Atlas Foundation. And this is just, I'll limit it to 30 seconds. This is just...
Dear Ecosians, welcome to this 21st tree update coming to you from Morocco. I'm here with Said. Said, where are we exactly?
So we are in the High Atlas Mountain in Anis village, and we are here with communities which we planted almost 4,000 fruit trees, included almond and olive and carob trees.
The village seems very committed, and I mean, look at this, how this almond tree is doing. We are at 1,600 meters.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not so easy to actually grow trees quickly here, but look, they're really taking care.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And that's what we are looking for the community who want to work with us and to make the project succeed.
No, I'm really happy about the progress we're seeing here in Morocco.
So if you're interested in that video, look it up on the Ecosia side. Ecosia, the search engine, they're one of the partners of the High Atlas Foundation. And that's actually how I became aware of this organization initially. Now, this is of course a bit of a sticking point. If you say you're doing a project in Morocco, you immediately, especially in UWC, you get a bit of pushback. Like, the first question is, why does it have to be, Morocco? Is this about it being in a developing country? Is this about helping the quote unquote poor people? Why travel so far to plant trees? Can't you do it at home? So I had to do quite a bit of explaining on that. And the simple answer is that, while I would actually have really liked to find a project that makes sense much closer to home, and it would have made many things much easier, the High Atlas Foundation simply is the best partner we found in terms of the approach, the experience, the scale, and the location. So it doesn't make much sense, for example, or it's very difficult to plant tens of thousands of trees in Germany because a lot of the area is taken up either by forests already or by agricultural land, and planting trees in forests doesn't really make sense. And if you plant trees in agricultural land, it just means that more food has to be grown somewhere else, so they cut trees down. I would have loved to find an organization like the High Atlas Foundation in Spain or in Portugal, where it makes sense climatically, where they have degraded landscapes that could be reforested. But I couldn't find anyone with the same breadth of experience, with the same amazing approach, and also with the same experience in education already as the High Atlas Foundation. So we very much chose them simply because they're the best people we could find for the job. And I want to stress that very much I'm not looking at this in any way, shape, or form as a development project. Quite the other way, actually, I see the High Atlas Foundation as the specialist partners who have something to offer that we just don't have and that we couldn't find anywhere closer. Really that experience in large-scale, community-led reforestation, ecosystem restoration. So I hope that's clear, but obviously we can still talk about this in the discussion. Is this neocolonialism? Does this still have a bit of a foul taste of why do we need to go to quote unquote Africa to do this? I'm very happy to defend it because in this case, it really is simply because they're the best people in the best place. And so after I visited them last summer in February this year, and in hindsight, it was very good timing because it was pretty much in the last week or two before, everything ground to a halt here. We had Joseph Ben Meyer, the president of the High Atlas Foundation, visit our college, do a presentation, and then he signed an agreement with Lawrence and with Thomas, with our management team. And the agreement was that we will pay them this year 18,000 euros for them to plant 24,000 fruit and nut trees with communities in the High Atlas Mountains in Morocco. So this is actually happening. We signed that agreement. And just last week, I got an update from their tree planter from site, who we saw in the video, that our trees are now being planted in 2 very remote nurseries. And he sent me some photos of, you can see there, this is compost and soil being put into seed trays. And this is tens of thousands of, I think, carob trees coming into existence. Anyone speak Arabic? I'm not sure. I'll just play.
هذه تراسة الرباح، حيت عندنا 4 لي تراس اللي دايرين فيهم الخروب. الطريقة دابا طريقة كما قلتي حديثة عصرية.
So I'm not sure if anyone understood anything, but this video, just a brief snippet, is showing actually our trees, quote unquote, our trees, even though of course they belong to the community, being planted. I think he's talking about carob trees. So this is really happening right now. So somewhere in the world, 24,000 little seeds are now hopefully in well-watered compost and gradually sprouting and growing, and will be planted out with communities probably in either December or January. So this really is actually the project becoming reality. So this is what's happened so far. But of course, there's still a long way to go between, somebody planting 24,000 trees for us and this whole grand vision of an education project where students from different schools and local students meet and learn about ecosystem restoration and all that. So I would say we are at the very first steps at the moment. Like the seedlings have been planted for the UWC Forest. At UWC RBC, the next steps will be that we continue and improve our carbon footprinting, because actually knowing exactly how much CO2 we emit for us is kind of, the driver and the rationale for keeping up this, what is an offsetting measure. We actually wanted to send a group of students to Morocco this summer in June. It's unfortunately, of course, not happening now. So probably we will have our first ecosystem restoration type short course in Morocco in 2021. And we're obviously always keeping our eyes open for other partners and sponsors for this kind of project, whether they want to send other people along, bring other schools on board, or maybe university students, or whether they simply want to pay us money for doing this project. We're always keeping our eyes open. And I think other UWCs, really, my invitation is simply come and join us. So any school that's interested in doing, carbon footprinting for the school, I'm very happy to discuss our methodology, and we maybe can learn from each other, because I think for the movement, the first step to have any credibility on climate change actually would be to even have a good idea about how much are we emitting in our different schools. And then we can talk about what we do about it. And we've, over the last 5 years, learned from quite a few mistakes and done some work on that. So I'm happy to share that and also learn from your experiences. For any of the European UWCs, I can definitely say the High Atlas Foundation has ensured me that they have capacity to plant, a few million more trees every year. So we'd be very happy for anyone else to come on board. Of course, you can also find your own projects, but this is something where we've already established links, and we very much, don't want to keep this for ourselves. Anyone who wants to join us, please do. And for all the other UWCs out there, I think that's missing a sentence, which is meant to be, find your own projects. I'm sure other UWCs actually find it easier to even find great projects locally and embark on something similar. And I think once different schools are trying to do this thing in different places, we hopefully have a lot of synergies and network effects and can learn from each other. So I'm very excited about right now, us having made some very first steps. And I know Singapore has done some things for what hopefully eventually over years and decades will grow into a network of forests all around the world, where UWC students learn about how to make the world a beautiful place again. So I'm sorry it's been a long presentation. I'll stop here, and I hope we still have time for some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Toby. That was such a great presentation. We'll do the UWC wave. That was really inspiring, and so many beautiful visuals as well. We are like a little short on time. We'll go about 10 minutes over if needed. If anyone needs to leave, of course, we understand, but just to give a bit of time for discussion. I will just get right to it with the speakers list. So first up on my list is Dominic.
Yeah, this is Dominic. Thanks very much for the great talk, Toby. My question really was about how do we scale this up to take a systems approach, so that the discussion around sustainability is not just about planting trees or restoring forests, but that it also takes the human-centered kind of approach. How do we exist with and within nature in a way that is balanced? So I was wondering how we are thinking about mainstreaming this into the curriculum and the culture of the UWC, not just in terms of like this is a subject, say in geography, but also, for instance, if you're doing a story in English, how do we make sure that that curriculum also focuses on stories that share a different view of the world? Because the knowledge that sometimes I laugh, as I'm growing up, the things that you think that you are discovering, there are people who have been doing them for like millions of years already. And I think that a big part of our ability to win this war on sustainability will really depend also on not just decolonizing the education of the UWC, but also making sure that the knowledge of other groups of people is also integrated into how we look at and understand the world. So you will find that in parts of the world, people already understand some of these sustainability issues. So my question is, are we giving some thought into how do we scale this up, given the tool that we have as an education institution, which is to say, how do we make this a big part of our curriculum, so that it's something that becomes very central to who we are, not just as a project, but in terms of how we learn, whether it's English or geography or economics and other areas. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So obviously this project in itself, is only one part of the puzzle. So, no one project can, in itself bring about the whole mind shift that we need to have with sustainability. But I think two important points that were made there are one about local knowledge. And I think this is something actually where ecosystem restoration and those kind of projects can really play a good role in terms of showing that very often this is about, for a lot of people in a lot of parts of the world, going back to actually how things have been done traditionally and through the traditional structures that have looked after the landscape very well for hundreds and thousands of years. And then only very recently, often suddenly, the regimes changed and they started destroying things. So it's very often about actually recognizing that the traditional way how people have done something was very valuable. And in terms of the, mindset and narrative, one thing, and I'm not sure if that actually directly answers your question, but it's an important point for me, is that what I love about this is that it gives us a different story about our role in ecosystems and in nature and in the world. Like so much of our sustainability narrative is basically about, the less there is of us, the better. We need to shrink our footprint. If we didn't exist at all, it would be the best. And I think that's a really discouraging message and narrative that I don't want to give young people. And I think this brings a bit of a different narrative into the story of saying actually humans can be a force for good. We can actually be people who also repair things and create something beautiful again. I mean, arguably still in the places where we messed it up in the first place. But I think a message of a philosophy of saying, we have a right to be there in the world. We have a right to be, to exist on this planet, and we actually can be a force for good, be part of healthy living ecosystems just as much as a tree or a beaver is. This is, I think, something of the wider mentality shift that I think comes from ecosystem restoration more than from just messaging about switching off the lights, let's say.
Thanks, Toby. I really love that answer. So next up was Mu. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yeah. Hi. So another Southern African, but my question was regarding curriculum and how do we integrate this into the IB curriculum. Already I think our movement has some quite unsustainable models of flying people around the world, and how do we offset that? Our campuses being quite old, looking at that. So I think doing some evaluation of where we stand as a movement would be a good idea, but how do we get that on the ground with the schools? How do we make it something that each school is looking at? Do we find a way to create positions? Do we find a way to have sustainability be more part of our core curriculum, even if it's not an IB course? Just how do we integrate it to make sure that it's something that we're talking about firsthand, and how do we become first movers in that? And then my second on the UWC Forests was, is there a way we could maybe use the national committees as opposed to the schools because there's just a wider spread? And is there a curriculum or a model that could be developed with yourself and a few other experts in what that would look like to either work with existing organizations or to develop groups that could work with national committees in different countries to set up these remote forests, so we're not flying everyone around, but then also that people then can get access to being part of the change. So it was, I guess, more internal, and then externally, how do we leverage our network?
Yeah, so I mean, bringing sustainability into the UWC movement overall, I think is a very hard question because it's so full already, right? There's so many things going on already, and so many things we're trying to achieve and trying to, do it in the classroom and outside the classroom. That it's a tricky one. I think, I mean, one of the early steps that I think that everyone could do is just doing monitoring. Like I think UWC, and this is maybe where the IO could take a leading role, on kind of having a harmonized monitoring approach that all UWCs are taking, kind of a unified approach. But so some little child is just wrestling with the microphone with me. So I think that, like, sort of one of the low-hanging fruits would be, through the IO having a unified approach to monitoring, and all the schools working out what's their impact in a kind of unified fashion. Beyond that, in the schools, I mean, we at RBC are really trying. Emma, can you go out? We are trying as much as possible to, for example, use global affairs to bring in sustainability related speakers, use the garden as much as possible, but it is difficult. And I think, the danger is that we might heap even more onto existing curricula, and we all know we need to avoid that. But this is where something like ecosystem restoration, I see scope for actually trying to weave it into curriculum elements that exist already. I mean, I'm thinking primarily about subjects like ESS and geography, or maybe physics if, renewable energy elements get involved, but obviously also, arguably something like English classes could talk about, very different aspects of this process of restoring paradise, let's say. So it is a difficult issue of, like, how do we bring sustainability into UWC, given that international understanding is naturally built in, but sustainability isn't. On the national committees part, definitely, I think that's an option to also have them involved also in, maybe national committees in the countries where projects are based. And in fact, the German National Committee is also very interested in, doing their own kind of offsetting work, maybe through the Moroccan project. So this is definitely something that I think it's not either schools or national committees, but I think it can kind of do a two-pronged approach that both national committees and schools work on this project.
Thanks, Toby. Okay, I think I'll take two more questions, and the rest, please feel free to continue asking them on the hub or to email Toby, and we can always continue the discussion off this forum as well. So I will actually, where was it? Oh, I lost my list. Janvi, if you still have a question that you'd like to
yeah, thank you. Thanks for the talk, Toby. I was at MUCI. Well, I am a graduate of UWC Red Cross Nordic, but at that time, most of the things people were just doing because it was good for the environment, not because of the mission of sustainability. But at MUCI, there were actually a lot of projects within in partnership with other communities or other organizations around the college, where they really try to students really try to get involved from a sustainable perspective, so that it's not just like something you do for a month and then come back, and actually like continue to work on projects for years on end to see them grow. And so my question is, how do you go about selecting the partners that you work with? Because like you said, that organization that you've partnered with in Morocco, it was just hands down the best partner you could find. And I've always been curious about, how generally we go about partnering with organizations and really understand them from a credibility point of view. Do you do like search on the internet and then you find people, or you find people and then through them other people? I mean, like, what exactly is the criteria to determine who is the best partner to collaborate on a project like this?
I think, I mean, as so often, I think with the Hiatus Foundation, the initial contact was more or less chance. Like I just found out about them through Ecosia. I was watching Ecosia videos and I saw them. But then in terms of, thinking about are they a good match or not, what really impressed me about them is their community focus. I think for anything in the field of restoration, if it's done, without actually caring about what local people want, it's going to fail. So I think anything that is ecosystem restoration has to be primarily about what actually helps the people who are at the place where this is happening, because nothing can succeed without that. But the other thing that I found very positive about the High Atlas Foundation, that I think that is something that makes a partner really suitable, is that they fully understand that the education aspect is super important. Like they fully are on board with the idea of not just, give us the money and we plant the trees, but actually saying, let's bring young people from, let's say, our school in Germany and from that region in Morocco together. Let's run courses on ecosystem restoration, like understanding that like it's as much an educational experience as it is about actually getting the restoration done. I think that's also important in a partner, because if a partner doesn't really actually value the education component, then I think it'll always probably be a struggle to try and squeeze that in when they just want to get their work done.
Okay, and actually the people who were on the list have just let me know that their questions were mostly already answered. So okay. That is about it, and we're perfectly 10 minutes over, so perfect.
Okay, right.
If you want to bring Emma back and let her say hi.
Emma, Emma, can you come? Emma, she never does anything anyone wants her to do, so Emma, where are you? Can you wave? Hello.
Hi, Emma.
Your tooth is falling out. Okay, so now the world knows that her tooth is falling out and the tooth fairy is gonna come.
Wow.
Show the tooth, Emma. Okay.
If everyone wants to say, if you want to unmute yourselves and say thank you and bye, and that's very welcome as you head out. Thank you so much, Tobi. That was an excellent talk, and thank you everyone.
Thank you all for having the patience to listen to me. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tobi. Super inspiring.
Tobi. Thanks everyone for being here.
Okay, thank you everyone.
Tobi,
Bye-bye.
appreciate it.
Email address.
Bye, Tobi. Well done.
Bye.